Hey lads, this is week 2 of Theory Thursdays, a series where we look at great chess players in the past and the principles and techniques they used to win their chess games. We are going to be trying to put some of those principles, techniques into our own games, and we're going to be looking at some of those today. Last week we looked at how to immobilize knights with wing pawns, and this week we're going to be looking at how to immobilize knights in general. So let's have a quick look at example 1. The first example that we have today is between these two players, Geller, and I'll just call him Mr. M because I'm not going to pretend that I know how to pronounce that Russian name or USSR name. I guess it was the USSR back then. This was played in 1978. Now you can see in this position that Black's knight is sitting on G7 and it only has 3 squares that it really can jump to. These lessons are going to be on restricting the enemy's knight, and you can probably see a way that we can somewhat restrict this knight, but it can't be fully restricted yet. I'm just going to flick through some of the moves that they played, and then we'll get to the position where we can actually restrict this knight. In this position, Geller took the knight, Black responded by capturing, and White attacked the bishop. The bishop needs to be defended twice. It can't move because we can eat the queen. So Black defends twice with both pieces. White captures, Black captures, White captures, Black captures. And in this position, the rook comes to D7 to attack the bishop. The bishop can't move because then they grab a pawn and threaten another piece. And it can't move back here because we grab a pawn and threaten another piece. So in this position, Black mistakenly defended the bishop with his rook. It would have been much better if he defended with his knight because the knight would have been on a better square, attacking another piece, and also it wouldn't be stuck. And so in this position, there's one move that is extremely good for Geller, and you're probably already seeing it. What are the squares this knight can jump to? It can't jump to E8 or E6 because there's pieces there. The only other 2 squares are F5 and H5. And so the move that Geller played, pawn to G4. Well done. Now that the knight is kind of trapped, we're able to move our other pieces into the game and attack. And it looks like this square over here on F6 is a very delicious looking one. Maybe the white knight could jump over to E4 and then up to F6, checking the king and hitting the rook and potentially winning an exchange here. Let's see how this game continues. H5, trying to remove that G4 pawn. We just defend the pawn by going H3. They take the G4 pawn. We recapture. We are still keeping this knight controlled. Over on the other side, B5 is pushed. A takes B5, A takes B5. Not a whole lot going on. So now White starts to move in his beautiful knight into the position. So he goes knight to E4. Black sees in this position that he can grab a free pawn. So he grabs a free pawn. But now the knight comes to D6. Checking the king. The king has to move or the piece is taken. Black, instead of moving his king, opts for taking the knight. And so now you can recapture with pawn. The pawn attacks the knight and still the knight has no squares to jump to and a pawn is attacking him. So White's just going to win the knight because he was able to trap the knight so well with this G4 pawn. The game continued. Rook takes B2, F takes G7, F5, trying to make a bit of space. Rook F3, doesn't really matter where the rook goes. F takes G4, the rook attacks the pawn. And Mikhailchishin here puts his rook onto the open file, but here Geller delivers the beautiful bishop C5. If Black were to take the bishop, check, king's only move, checkmate. A beautiful checkmate. So in this position, if Black can't take the bishop, what can he do? Well, he actually just resigns because this threat is way too strong. Geller used the G4 pawn to move a couple squares from the opposing knight just to restrict that knight's maneuverability and gain a winning advantage from it. Let's jump into example number 2 of how we can restrict the opponent's pieces. This next example comes from a game played in 1967 between Ullmann and Schmidt. This game, you can see that white controls the only open file on the board, which is an advantage, but black has an extra pawn, which is an advantage. So a fairly even game. Another thing we can see that is a disadvantage for black, and why the engine says white is slightly ahead in this position, is the piece activity of black's pieces. This knight is sitting here looking at b5 and c8. Not super great, and the rook's all the way in the corner, only looking at a handful of squares. In this position, white plays the queen to g4, trying to offer a queen trade. If the trade happens, well, white has the open file and can move his rook to d7 and start munching these pawns, which would be a very good thing. Black doesn't want the queen trade, obviously, and so he plays the pawn to f5. In this position, Ullmann plays the queen to c4, hitting the queen with the king behind it, so the queen can't move out of the way, which means it's going to be traded off probably very soon. Now, black could play the king up, he could take the queen, and the king comes to e6, that's one option, or he could take the queen and force white to have two isolated pawns. Now, that looks like a very appealing thing for black, to make your opponent have isolated pawns. But it's not so good here, because after he gets the two pawns isolated, you can see this pawn on c4 is doing a fantastic job at holding that b5 square. Black wants to bring his knight to b5, but he's now stuck in the corner and is not able to move because of where this trade took place. Here, black is in a bit of a predicament. He knows that this rook is coming to the d7 square. It's going to be targeting this pawn and winning it. He could just defend his pawn, but then he's just losing this pawn, and he's probably losing this one very shortly after. So he decides to put his rook onto the most active square he can find, which is rook to f8, defending the f5 pawn. And even though the e5 pawn is the one that's under attack, maybe this f5 pawn can move forwards, take, and he could grab this square and then attack the c4 pawn. That would be black's hope here. White takes the pawn on e5. Black gets onto the 7th rank so that no infiltration can happen. But in this position here, white's move is a little bit odd because the pawn is containing the b5 knight. But what you'll see now starts to make a lot of sense. He plays the pawn to c5. And the reason he does this is kind of a little tricky to see, but you'll see it in just a second. If the knight were to come to b5, then white could check. The rook has to block. He can now come to d7, and the pawn cannot push because we capture it. So this looks very good for Ullmann. In this position, black, instead of wanting to put his knight on b5, decides to put it on c8. And c8 is not a great move. Now, we can't fork the two pieces because the rook can defend the knight, but this knight can't really come to these squares that it wants to come to, and the white pawn is stopping the b7 pawn from moving. So this pawn is again containing the enemy knight. Here, white decides to play the pawn to f4 just to solidify his bishop on this beautiful square, and black plays b6, trying to get rid of this pawn. It's really annoying, but before white decides to recapture, he throws in a check, forking the king and the rook. And now this is actually quite a nice fork for him, because when black defends the knight, white captures the knight, black recaptures, and white wins the pawn. This pawn cannot be stopped because black can't go to either of these dark squares with this bishop sitting on e5. A beautiful finish to the game. And it was actually in this position where white's just recaptured the knight that Mr. Schmidt resigned the game. We can see in this game that white was able to restrict this knight on a7, first by getting the pawn on c4, attacking the b5 square, and then secondly, getting his pawn up to c5, attacking the b6 and d6 squares. Because of the unique way that knights move in chess, they're the easiest piece to contain. We want to immobilize the enemy's knights as best as possible in chess games. And hopefully you can start to see here how we can immobilize with a simple pawn in multiple positions in a chess game. Now we also can use minor pieces to control knights. And specifically, we can use the bishop to control the knight. I'm going to give you a few examples of how bishops can control knights very, very easily. In this next example, we have Michael Adams, a chess grandmaster from England, and Murray Chandler, a chess grandmaster from New Zealand. And this game was played in 1989. In this position, it looks extremely even, but white's knight on h4 is very awkward. And often in chess, when you're playing a chess game, you want to look at your pieces and say, if you don't really know what you're going for or how to proceed in a game, you want to say, where are my pieces better placed? We can see for black, maybe black wants to get his bishop onto a better square. Maybe he wants to put it here on e7. Maybe he wants to get it over here, checking the king. Maybe he wants it in a more central square like c5. White's probably also saying the same thing. Where does he want this knight? Well, he doesn't want it where it is. It's on the side of the board, and we all know a knight on the rim is dim. And so he probably wants to transfer it over to f3. And we see from f3, then maybe it can come to e5 or to d4. d4 looks particularly appealing because it blocks this rook's scope. The rook would only be able to see a few squares in front of it if there's a knight here blocking it. So it would make sense that white wants to get his knight to this square. Now, how can black stop that while developing his own pieces to squares that he wants to be on? Well, we already said it would be nice if black could get his bishop to c5, and c5 would attack the d4 square. He's also got a knight looking at the d4 square. What move would you play that would enable you to get your bishop to c5? b6. Now that move, if I asked you a couple minutes ago, what move would you play here? I guarantee you nobody's saying b6. It's just not the kind of move you would play. But when you start to see the position and understand the position and understand where you want your pieces and where your opponent wants his pieces, then you start to find moves like b6. So we play b6, white decides to bring his knight over, but now we can play bishop to c5, and we are controlling this center square 2 times. So in this position, white decides to get rid of one of those defenders, and now the pawn on c5 is controlling the enemy knight. Black is controlling this square with his knight and his pawn, and he's also controlling this square with his knight. So white's knight is not able to develop where it wanted to develop, and black still has this beautiful file all to himself, which maybe he can use at some point later in the game. These kinds of moves you're not going to spot unless you really understand the position, and then you're going to be like, oh, of course that's what I play, because I know what I'm going for. This example is a really good one because you can see in it how you can use your minor pieces to limit knights. And in this example, we're going to see how the bishop completely dominates the knight. Now, even though in this example, black is being played by Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player of the ages, he has a knight and his opponent, Mr. Pentala, has a bishop. So we're going to see how this goes. Even though this position is completely equal, the move that black has to play is pawn to f6, but instead he plays king to f6, trying to take opposition from the enemy king. This is a move I would play. And now black's knight is completely dominated. The bishop attacks the knight. So what's the knight going to do? It's going to look at the squares it can jump to, not these ones. So it can go to a7 or it can go to e7. So it jumps over to a7, targeting this pawn over here. The white bishop attacks black's pawn. Black attacks white's pawn. White takes. Black takes. White takes. And so now white is up 1 pawn. Just look at every single move by white. They are always attacking the black knight. The knight moves, gets attacked. The knight moves, it gets attacked. The knight moves, it gets attacked. The knight moves, and now it can't be attacked, but instead the bishop can dominate it by attacking the 2 squares that the knight can jump to. If black wants to move his king, then a simple c6, and he's going to have to capture here, and a bishop's going to help these pawns promote. So it's not going to be too hard for white to win this. Instead of moving the king, black decides to move the knight. The knight jumps over here, so the pawn can start to promote. The king can move in to stop that pawn. If the pawn pushes, the king eats the bishop and then will eat the pawn when it promotes. So here, white just moves his king up. Black checks the king, and white moves his king over. In this position, if black takes, white takes, black takes, and the king can come here. Black can defend here, but the king can move over to g7, take this pawn, move back to g7, and the pawn can promote. Bishops really destroy knights in endgames. You can always attack the knight and force it to move, or you can prevent the knight moving to the squares it wants to move to. I have two more examples for you guys. One is just a case study that was done in 1925, and the second one is a game between two players, one of which was Mikhail Tal. I think this case study is super helpful because it'll help you think about the position, and you'll see, where do my pieces need to be? How do I get them to those squares? Let's have a quick look at it. In this example, I want you to first look at where black's knight can go. Look at the squares, find the squares. Then ask yourself, what square would the white bishop best be placed on to stop black's knight moving? I hope you all looked and saw the square b4. If the bishop was over here on b4, it would stop the knight jumping to all the squares that it can currently jump to. How can we get the bishop to that square? Well, we have to make some threats first. So the first threat we're going to make is pushing f7. Black needs to stop this pawn promoting, so he's obviously going to come here. White can now move his bishop to e7, preparing the pawn to promote, but the king can take the pawn before it promotes. And now the bishop can come and sit on b4. Black cannot move his knight. All white's king has to do is move over here and eat this knight. Let's see what this might look like. f6, f2, e5, e3. And then here, maybe f5, I don't know, maybe d5 is probably a good example. d3, maybe c6 if it's still trying to get over here to this bishop to stop the bishop. The king can come c2. Enemy king can come to b5, attacking the bishop. But now the bishop can simply move, maybe over to e7. It's still defending this square, and black's knight is still in danger. It can't jump to these two squares because the king is holding them. So let's say it jumps here, checks the king, it's just going to get eaten, and white is going to win this game. I hope that case study made a lot of sense. You can start to see, if you understand what you want to do, where you want your piece to be, then it makes a lot of logical sense for what moves you're going to make to get to that position. The last example is a beautiful example from a game between Tal, the famous Latvian Soviet chess player, playing against Vogt, who is a German grandmaster. Let's have a quick look at this final example. In this position, black's knight can only move to two squares, and so the bishop could either come back to a5 or over to d8, both moves about exactly the same. But Tal chose to put his bishop on d8, hitting both of the squares that the knight can jump to. Vogt played knight to e6, attacking that bishop. Tal didn't worry about his bishop, and he instead just attacked the knight, but also attacked a very powerful rook. The rook needs to move, so it does, attacking the pawn. It's always attack, attack, attack. White takes that knight off that was attacking his beautiful bishop, and white recaptures with the rook, knowing that his bishop is extremely powerful and black's knight is not. So the rest of the game proceeds like this. King f2, king f7, king e3, king e8, bishop e5, king d7, and king d4. If black really wants to try get his knight into the game, he could, but it would just result in white having opposition. The black king has to move somewhere, and if he starts to try to promote this pawn, the king can just come over and eat it. Yes, the black king can come over to b6, but he can't move in because this pawn is doing such a good job of defending, and the white king is going to eat up these two pawns. Vogt resigned in this position because he saw how bad his knight was being dominated by this bishop. Thanks lads for watching. I really do hope this video was helpful in getting you to see how chess players think about positions, where they want their pieces best placed, and also how to simply stop your opponent's knights from being able to maneuver where they want to maneuver. You can keep attacking them, or you can restrict the squares they can jump to. Hopefully you're able to find these kinds of ideas in your own chess games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you lads tomorrow.